For over 1,000 years, the titles of English royalty have echoed through the corridors of power, tradition, and storytelling. More than mere designations of rank, these titles have shaped nations, defined destinies, and captured the imagination of people across the globe. From medieval battlefields to glittering coronations, royal titles have been both the instruments of control and the emblems of legacy, evolving alongside the very fabric of British society. They have marked eras, upheld ideologies, and kindled both reverence and rebellion. Even in today's world of democracy and digital connectivity, the fascination with kings, queens, princes, and dukes remains unshaken, a testament to their enduring influence and mystique. Welcome to Words of Time, and let us journey through the legacy of English royal titles, where history and heritage converge, and where each name tells a story far greater than itself. The concepts of king and queen carry immense historical and symbolic weight, yet their basic definitions are rooted in early human attempts to organize, protect, and govern. In the simplest terms, a king is a male ruler of a nation or territory who usually inherits his position through family lineage. A queen is often the female counterpart, either the wife of a reigning king or, in her own right, the sovereign ruler. But over centuries, these roles became deeply layered with political, religious, and cultural meanings that stretched far beyond their functional definitions. The origin of kingship dates back to ancient civilizations when tribal leaders and warlords consolidated power through strength, charisma, or divine claim. To be a king was to be more than a political leader. It was to be viewed as a conduit to the divine, a protector of the realm, and a symbol of national unity. Queens, too, evolved from consorts into powerful political actors, often ruling as regents, advisors, or even sovereigns. These titles were both roles and identities, codified through rituals, legal systems, and social hierarchies. The distinction between a ruler's symbolic presence and practical authority was often blurred. People bowed not only to the man or woman who bore the title but to the centuries of meaning embedded in the crown they wore. In England, the early monarchs were not the godlike figures that later kings and queens came to resemble. The earliest kings of what would become England were tribal leaders, chiefs who led groups of people in what was a fractured and decentralized region. These early rulers often had control only over a patch of land, a region such as Mercia, Wessex, or Northumbria. There was no king of England in the unified sense until much later. The word king was derived from the Old English word signing, and these rulers often gained their positions not just by birth but also by election or acclaim from nobles and warriors. The authority of these early kings was not absolute. They were bound by customs, reliant on the support of powerful lords, and continually defending their realms from both internal and external threats. Queens in this early period were generally consorts rather than sovereigns. Their roles were often limited to the domestic and ceremonial, although many wielded influence behind the scenes. They advised their husbands, managed royal households, and crucially produced heirs. But even within these constrained roles, some queens exercised real political agency, either by acting as intermediaries or by taking charge during their husbands' absences. Over time, a queen's role became increasingly formalized, and while queens regnant, those who ruled in their own right, were rare, they set powerful precedents when they did emerge. As centuries passed, the idea of kingship evolved, especially as Christianity spread across Europe. With it came the belief in the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs were chosen by God to rule and thus were accountable only to him. This idea radically altered the king's role in society. Now, to oppose the king was not only treason but also blasphemy. The coronation ceremony became a sacred rite, a fusion of political and religious symbolism. Kings were anointed with holy oil, echoing the biblical kings of Israel, and were seen as defenders of the faith. Queens, too, underwent coronations, although with different rites, signifying their elevated but still secondary status. England's early medieval kings, figures such as Alfred the Great, began to centralize authority, issuing laws and organizing defenses against invasions. Alfred, in particular, laid the groundwork for the concept of an English monarchy with a national identity. His reign in the late 9th century saw the formation of systems of justice, defense, and education that shaped the kingdom's foundations. Still, even with these developments, England was far from unified. It would take both time and conquest to forge a truly cohesive monarchy. The Norman conquest was the turning point that fundamentally redefined the monarchy, its titles, and its power structures. William, Duke of Normandy, claimed that he had been promised the English throne by Edward the Confessor. When Harold Godwin's son took the crown upon Edward's death, William invaded, defeating Harold at the Battle of Hastings. With that victory, William became William the Conqueror, and the entire English monarchy was altered forever. William's claim to the throne was both military and ideological. He argued that his victory was sanctioned by God, reinforced by the Pope's blessing, and underpinned by a divine right to rule. Upon seizing the crown, he did not merely become another English king, he imposed a new regime, a new aristocracy, and a new way of understanding monarchy. The Norman conquest brought with it a transformation of not only who held power but how power was expressed and legitimized. One of the most visible changes was in language and titles. Anglo-Saxon names and customs were quickly replaced or subordinated to Norman French traditions. The word king remained, but the mechanisms of rule were infused with continental feudalism. Titles such as duke, earl, baron, and count gained prominence, and their meanings were systematized under the feudal hierarchy. William distributed land to his Norman followers, creating a new aristocratic class loyal to him. These men were not just powerful warlords, they were vassals of the king, bound by oaths of fealty and service. The queen's role also changed under Norman influence. Matilda of Flanders, William's wife, was not only a queen consort but an active political figure. She ruled in William's absence and was crowned with full ceremony. Norman queens were often more politically active than their Anglo-Saxon predecessors, owing in part to continental traditions that recognized queens as counselors and regents. The monarchy itself was becoming more institutionalized, and with it the queen's place became more formalized. Under William and his successors, the crown took on a new aura of centralized authority. The monarch became not just a war leader but the head of a legal and administrative system. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1086, was an immense survey of land ownership and resources throughout England. This document symbolized the king's reach into the everyday lives of his subjects. No longer was the king merely a warlord among peers, he was the sovereign ruler, above and apart from his nobility. The structure of monarchy was no longer a loose collection of lords rallying around a chieftain but a hierarchical, codified system in which the king stood at the apex. His title meant more than lineage. It meant ownership of the realm, the power to levy taxes, enforce laws, and dispense justice. The monarchy became hereditary in a more rigid sense, though succession was still frequently contested. The question of legitimacy, who had the right to be king, continued to provoke wars, intrigues, and rival claims for centuries to come. The symbolism surrounding the monarchy intensified. Coronations became lavish ceremonies, and the regalia crown, scepter, orb took on almost mystical significance. The king was not only a ruler but an embodiment of the nation. The queen in turn was more than a consort, she was an emblem of continuity, grace, and dynastic power. The use of seals, coats of arms, and royal proclamations reinforced the notion of a centralized, authoritative monarchy. William's successors, such as Henry I and Henry II, continued to build upon this foundation. Henry II established legal reforms that would form the basis of English common law. The king was now the ultimate source of justice, and his court set precedents that shaped governance for centuries. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was a powerful queen in her own right, with lands, influence, and political acumen. Her presence in the court demonstrated how queens could function as partners in governance rather than mere ornaments of royalty. As the monarchy grew more institutional, the distinction between public and private roles of the king and queen also sharpened. Kings were expected to wage war, administer justice, and govern wisely. Queens were expected to bear heirs, manage courtly life, and serve as symbols of virtue and piety. Yet these roles often overlapped. In times of crisis, queens stepped into roles traditionally reserved for men, leading armies, brokering peace, or serving as regents for underage heirs. The centuries following the Norman conquest saw further elaboration of titles and honors. Monarchs adopted increasingly grand titles such as Defender of the Faith, King of England and France, and eventually Emperor of India. These titles were not merely ceremonial, they reflected the reach and ambition of the English crown. The Queen's titles expanded as well, and with the Tudor and later Stuart periods, queens began to rule as sovereigns more frequently, from Mary I to Elizabeth I and beyond. This transformation from tribal leaders to symbolic heads of a constitutional monarchy was centuries in the making. But the crucial turning point was undoubtedly the Norman conquest. It introduced a new language of power, a feudal structure, and an institutional monarchy that replaced the fluid, often volatile leadership of the Anglo-Saxon era. Kings and queens were no longer merely first among equals, they were the axis upon which the kingdom turned. Even as the absolute power of the monarchy would eventually be curtailed first by the Magna Carta, then by the development of Parliament, and later by the rise of constitutional government, the foundational shift begun by William the Conqueror remained embedded in the fabric of the English monarchy. The reverence for title, the legal centrality of the crown, and the symbolic weight of being a king or queen endured. Thus, the evolution of royalty in England is a story of transformation from practical leadership rooted in tribal loyalties to an institution enshrined in ritual, law, and myth. The meanings of king and queen have shifted across time, yet their core significance, authority, identity, and continuity has remained. What began as simple titles have become enduring symbols of a nation's past and present, a lineage stretching from warrior chiefs to modern monarchs. And it all found its definitive reshaping in the winds that blew from Normandy in 1066, carrying with them a new idea of what it meant to rule. As societies evolved and governance became more structured, the English monarchy found itself expanding beyond the simple duality of king and queen. Titles proliferated not only to recognize the growing complexity of ruling a diverse and increasingly centralized realm but also to address the logistical need for administrative efficiency, delegation of power, and management of loyalty among the nobility. The rise of new titles such as Duke, Duchess, Earl, Marquis, and Baron was not merely a semantic development, it was a reflection of a society becoming more hierarchical, regionalized, and politically intricate. These titles began to take on roles that were both ceremonial and practical, signifying not just social rank but also territorial responsibility and political expectation. Among the most prestigious of these was the title of Duke, derived from the Latin dux, meaning leader or commander. It originally carried military connotations in the Roman world, and when transplanted into medieval Europe, it maintained an association with authority over a large territory. In England, the title was introduced relatively late compared to the continent. The first English duke was Edward, the Black Prince, who was created Duke of Cornwall in 1337. This marked a major departure from prior norms, where the highest non-royal title had typically been that of noble. The elevation of a royal son to duke signified a new phase in English peerage, in which the monarchy began to carve out clearer lines of noble hierarchy. Dukedoms were granted as honors but also as strategic tools to secure loyalty and manage distant regions on the crown's behalf. Dukes often held semi-autonomous power within their regions, with the authority to collect taxes, raise armies, and enforce the king's law, although always in the monarch's name. Duchesses, the female counterparts of dukes, played a complementary but increasingly significant role. Initially, duchesses were wives of dukes and held power indirectly through their husbands. However, some, particularly in cases of widowhood or minority of heirs, governed lands and administered duties in their own names. Their positions required a blend of diplomacy, stewardship, and social influence. As noblewomen gained more educational opportunities and political exposure through court life, duchesses emerged as patrons of the arts and culture and as key players in dynastic alliances through marriage negotiations. The granting of duchies to royal offspring also elevated the duchess to a royal figure in her own right, creating a role that merged aristocratic power with royal prestige. Other titles filled out the honor system, including Marquis and Baron. A Marquis governed a march, a border territory often requiring military readiness and political savvy due to its position on the kingdom's frontier. Though not as prestigious as a duke, a Marquis held considerable power in regions where loyalty to the crown could be fragile. The title of Baron, on the other hand, was a staple of the feudal system and initially referred to a direct tenant-in-chief of the king. Over time, barons formed the backbone of England's landed gentry and were summoned to early forms of parliament. The hierarchy among these titles became more rigid as the monarchy increasingly relied on these nobles to maintain law and order across the kingdom. As these noble titles took shape and became institutionalized, another set of titles emerged, those signifying not just noble status but royal blood. The titles Prince and Princess began to gain prominence, serving a different function from titles granted to the nobility. Rooted in the Latin princeps, meaning first or chief, the title Prince was reserved for the children of the monarch and other close relatives of the crown. Its primary role was to mark proximity to the throne and signify the bearer's part in the dynastic line. Unlike dukes or earls, princes did not necessarily govern regions, though they were often granted lands or titles like dukedoms to support their status and income. The importance of this title reached new heights with the rise of Edward of Woodstock, famously known as the Black Prince. As the eldest son of King Edward III, he was given the title Prince of Wales and later became Duke of Cornwall and Prince of Aquitaine. Though he never became king himself, his legacy reshaped the perception of the title Prince. He was a formidable military leader, known for his victories during the 100 Years' War, particularly at the Battle of Poitiers. The Black Prince's martial prowess and courtly demeanor turned the princely title into more than a marker of lineage. It became associated with valor, leadership, and national identity. His black armor and coat of arms bearing 3 ostrich feathers became iconic, and his style of leadership left a lasting imprint on the concept of what it meant to be a prince. In his hands, the title was not passive or ceremonial. He actively led troops, negotiated treaties, and governed large territories. His role as Prince of Aquitaine was emblematic of how a prince could function as a quasi-independent ruler within the larger framework of the monarchy. This dual role, both subordinate to and representative of the king, made the title of prince a powerful instrument of statecraft. As the monarchy stabilized and succession practices became more formalized, the title Prince of Wales emerged as the standard designation for the heir apparent to the English and later British throne. The origins of this title are deeply entwined with England's conquest and colonization of Wales. Following the death of Llywelyn, the last native Prince of Wales, in 1282, Edward I of England declared his infant son, the future Edward II, as Prince of Wales in 1301. This symbolic act was designed to assert English dominance over the Welsh people and to co-opt the title into the English royal lexicon. From that point onward, the title Prince of Wales was customarily bestowed upon the monarch's eldest son. It was a way of announcing the line of succession and consolidating royal authority. The title carried significant ceremonial and political weight, especially as it became tied to Welsh identity and history. The investiture ceremony, often held in Wales, symbolized a form of reconciliation and unity between the English crown and the Welsh people, though in practice, it often reinforced the subordination of the latter. The role of the Prince of Wales evolved over the centuries. In earlier times, the prince might govern a region or lead armies, but over time the title became more symbolic. It served as a way to prepare the heir for kingship by involving him in state functions, public engagements, and more recently, charitable and civic work. The Prince of Wales increasingly took on the role of national ambassador, a public figure whose actions and demeanor could influence public opinion about the monarchy itself. Despite its ceremonial tone, the title has not been free from controversy, particularly in its relationship with Wales and the Welsh identity. Many Welsh nationalists and cultural leaders have viewed the title as a relic of conquest and colonialism, a reminder of a time when native Welsh leadership was supplanted by an English monarchy. The 1969 inauguration of Prince Charles, later Charles III, at Carnarvon Castle, was met with both celebration and protest. For some, it was a moment of national unity; for others, a painful reminder of historical domination. The tension surrounding the title has persisted into the 21st century. Debates have emerged over whether the title should continue, be retired, or transformed into something more inclusive. Following the accession of King Charles III, his son Prince William was granted the title Prince of Wales. While the announcement was widely accepted, it also reopened conversations about the title's future, especially given the growing movement in Wales for increased autonomy or even independence. The monarchy's challenge lies in navigating these evolving sentiments while preserving the institution's traditions and symbolic roles. Beyond the Prince of Wales, the use of prince and princess has been tightly controlled within the royal family. Traditionally, only the children and grandchildren of the monarch in the male line were automatically entitled to the title prince or princess, though exceptions have been made. Over time, changes to royal protocol and public attitudes have influenced how these titles are applied and understood. The desire to slim down the monarchy, reduce its public cost, and modernize its image has led to fewer royals being given these titles, and greater public scrutiny of what such titles actually mean in a democratic society. The title princess has carried a unique set of challenges and expectations. While princes were expected to lead, represent, and prepare for governance, princesses historically faced more restrictive roles centered on marriage and diplomacy. Princesses were often used as pawns in dynastic marriages, tools for forging alliances or bringing peace. Yet, many found ways to exert influence, becoming patrons of the arts, political advisors, or regents. Over time, and especially in the modern era, princesses have redefined their roles, engaging in public service, charity, and even political advocacy. These developments highlight how titles, far from being static, have continually evolved to reflect the political, cultural, and social needs of the monarchy and the society it serves. From the practical governance roles of dukes and duchesses, to the dynastic symbolism of princes and princesses, and the unique legacy of the Prince of Wales, the English later British monarchy has constructed a layered hierarchy of titles that blends tradition with adaptation. Each title represents more than rank. It encapsulates a story of power, region, and identity. Dukes and duchesses signify territorial authority and noble stewardship. Princes and princesses embody lineage and dynastic continuity. The Prince of Wales stands at the intersection of conquest, symbolism, and modern succession. These roles have shifted in meaning and scope across centuries, but all have contributed to the complexity of the royal institution. The continued relevance of these titles and the debates surrounding them underscore their enduring role in the public imagination and the constitutional fabric of the United Kingdom. As the monarchy continues to adapt in the 21st century, questions of tradition versus reform remain central. The rise of new titles in the past reflected a society in flux, defining power structures to manage an expanding and diversifying realm. In many ways, these same dynamics persist today, though shaped by democracy, media, and public opinion rather than medieval warfare or feudal loyalty. What remains clear is that these titles, born of necessity and ambition, have become woven into the narrative of the nation, each one a chapter in the unfolding story of royal power and public identity. In the present day, the British monarchy finds itself at a complex crossroads, historically grounded yet facing continuous reassessment in a fast-evolving democratic society. The monarchy, once the absolute epicenter of governance and authority, is now a constitutional institution with limited political power but vast symbolic, cultural, and historical significance. King Charles III, having ascended the throne following the death of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, occupies this landscape of tradition and transformation. His reign represents both continuity and uncertainty, a symbol of inherited legitimacy, yet also the focal point of debates regarding national identity, social responsibility, public finance, and the relevance of monarchy itself in a modern, pluralistic society. King Charles III carries multiple titles, each with layered historical meaning. In the United Kingdom, he is officially known as Charles III by the grace of God, King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and of his other realms and territories, Head of the Commonwealth, Defender of the Faith. These titles, ceremonial as they may seem, reflect centuries of geopolitical change and cultural influence. Defender of the Faith, for example, was first granted to Henry VIII by the Pope before his break with the Catholic Church, and though the religious landscape has changed significantly since then, the title endures. The role of monarch now includes being a figurehead for national unity, continuity, and ceremonial life, opening Parliament, representing Britain on the world stage, and serving as a patron of numerous charities and cultural institutions. Charles III also rules as monarch over 14 other Commonwealth realms, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where his position is primarily symbolic but still constitutionally enshrined. The Commonwealth itself, a voluntary association of 56 countries, is another part of the modern monarch's responsibility, though leadership of the Commonwealth is not hereditary. Charles was chosen to succeed his mother as head of the Commonwealth in 2018, a position he now uses to advocate for global cooperation, environmental causes, and youth leadership. King Charles's accession came at a time of social tension and generational change, with public opinion about the monarchy varying sharply across different demographics. While many respect the continuity and traditions embodied in the institution, others question its place in a democratic and increasingly egalitarian society. The legacy of colonialism, growing wealth inequality, and evolving social norms around gender, race, and privilege have added layers of complexity to how the public interprets royal roles and responsibilities. Charles himself, a longtime environmental advocate and proponent of organic farming, has tried to present a modern image of monarchy, focusing on sustainability, interfaith dialogue, and responsible leadership. However, his more outspoken and sometimes controversial history as Prince of Wales, particularly his views on architecture, alternative medicine, and the environment, have made some question whether he can maintain the traditional neutrality expected of a reigning monarch. One of the most critical elements of the modern monarchy is the institution of the heir apparent, embodied today in Prince William, who now holds the titles of Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall. These two titles carry not only symbolic weight but also legal and financial responsibilities. As Prince of Wales, William is the first in line to the throne and represents the continuity of the monarchy. The title has traditionally been granted to the eldest son of the reigning monarch since the 14th century, with a complex history rooted in the English conquest of Wales. It has become a ceremonial role that includes national and international duties, charitable patronage, and occasional representation of the monarch at state functions. William's appointment to this title came with both public support and ongoing scrutiny. The title itself remains controversial in Wales, where some view it as a relic of colonial imposition. Movements calling for either the abolition or the reform of the title have gained traction, especially among younger Welsh citizens who feel it symbolizes a lack of recognition for Wales's distinct cultural and political identity. Advocates for retaining the title argue that it serves as a bridge between the monarchy and the Welsh people, especially if wielded with sensitivity and inclusiveness. In parallel, William also inherited the title of Duke of Cornwall, a designation that carries significant financial implications. The Duchy of Cornwall is a vast portfolio of land, real estate, and investments created in 1337 to provide income for the heir to the throne. It spans over 130,000 acres across more than 20 counties and is worth over £1 billion. The duchy provides a large private income for the Prince of Wales, independent of taxpayer funding. This financial independence has been used to argue in favor of the monarchy's self-sufficiency, but it has also prompted criticism, especially from those who question the equity of such land holdings in a society struggling with housing shortages, land access, and economic disparity. The controversy surrounding the Duchy of Cornwall is not new but has intensified as public scrutiny of elite wealth has grown. While defenders argue that the duchy is well managed and provides employment and sustainability projects across the country, critics see it as an example of inherited privilege that exists outside the scope of democratic oversight. The fact that the duchy is exempt from some forms of taxation, despite Charles voluntarily paying income tax on his revenues when he held the title, has also sparked debate about fairness, transparency, and accountability. Personal lives have increasingly become a part of the public narrative around royal titles and their holders. The modern media age, with its 24-hour news cycles and viral social platforms, has exposed royal figures to unprecedented levels of scrutiny and commentary. Prince William, while generally viewed favorably, remains under the public lens, particularly in contrast to his brother, Prince Harry, whose departure from royal duties and public criticism of the institution have widened public conversations about monarchy, race, mental health, and media intrusion. The strained relationship between the two brothers has led many to re-evaluate the personal costs of royal life and the expectations placed on individuals born into the institution. Public perception of the monarchy and the weight of royal titles has shifted notably in recent decades. Where once these titles commanded unchallenged deference, they are now regularly questioned by a society that values meritocracy, transparency, and egalitarianism. The idea of titles being inherited rather than earned feels increasingly anachronistic to some, especially as other areas of public life emphasize equality and inclusion. The term prince or duke no longer guarantees respect or relevance. Its meaning is shaped by the actions and conduct of its holder, and public opinion plays a decisive role in how it is interpreted. Much of this scrutiny comes back to the issue of cost. The monarchy receives public funding through the sovereign grant, which is a percentage of the profits generated by the crown estate, a massive collection of land and property that is legally owned by the monarch but operated in the public interest. The percentage allocated to the sovereign grant was temporarily increased to support the refurbishment of Buckingham Palace, drawing public ire at a time of national austerity. Although defenders point out that the monarchy contributes significantly to tourism and diplomacy and that the grant represents only a tiny fraction of government spending, the question remains: should a modern democratic society support an unelected institution based on hereditary privilege? Support for the monarchy remains strong among older generations, but surveys show growing indifference or outright opposition among younger Britons. These generational shifts, combined with increased awareness of historical injustices associated with colonialism and empire, have put the monarchy under a new kind of pressure, less overtly political, perhaps, but no less powerful. Questions around diversity, inclusion, and justice now influence how royal roles are interpreted, especially when controversies arise, such as those involving the treatment of Meghan Markle or the monarchy's response to issues of race and representation. In this atmosphere, royal titles can no longer rest on tradition alone. They are now a kind of public trust, whose holders are expected to justify their roles not through divine right or ancient law, but through service, humility, and relevance. The monarchy's ability to survive into the next generation will likely depend on how well it adapts to these expectations, while still preserving enough of its identity to command public interest and respect. Efforts to modernize the institution have been visible in recent years. The royal family has embraced more direct engagement with the public, often through social media, and has emphasized causes that resonate with contemporary values: mental health, environmental sustainability, youth empowerment, and veterans' welfare. Titles have been used strategically in this modernization effort. When Catherine, Princess of Wales, took on her new role, it came with an intentional focus on early childhood development and public health, signaling a new kind of royal service aimed at tangible impact rather than mere ceremonial duty. Still, challenges remain. The monarchy must strike a careful balance between tradition and change. Titles like King, Queen, Prince of Wales, and Duke of Cornwall carry centuries of heritage but must now operate within a democratic society that prizes accountability and transparency. The ability of these titles to adapt to mean something meaningful to contemporary audiences will determine whether the institution they represent continues to flourish or slowly loses relevance. The monarchy today exists as a paradox, an institution rooted in hereditary privilege that must justify itself through public service, a relic of imperial history that aspires to modern values of equality and justice, a family at the center of national identity that is also deeply human, with all the flaws, struggles, and contradictions that entails. The titles they bear, ancient, prestigious, sometimes contentious, are no longer just inherited names. They are roles that must be earned in the eyes of the public, shaped by action, and justified through responsibility. As the monarchy moves forward under King Charles III and the new generation of royals, the meaning and function of those titles will continue to evolve, still powerful, but forever under the watchful gaze of a society that demands more than lineage. The British monarchy, while stripped of most of its legal power over the centuries, remains one of the most symbolically charged institutions in the world. Central to its enduring influence is the continued use and careful distribution of titles, from king and queen to duke, duchess, prince, princess, and beyond. These titles carry deep historical significance, having evolved over centuries to reflect the political structures, power dynamics, and social values of the times. Today they represent not only a link to the past but a live, contested marker of influence, identity, and national symbolism. While the monarchy officially functions within the framework of constitutional democracy, titles still serve as mechanisms of soft power, tools by which the royal family asserts relevance, defines its internal hierarchy, and shapes public perception. Understanding these titles and the roles they play both within the royal family and in wider society reveals much about the subtle and often invisible power structures that lie behind the crown. Titles have always been more than ornamental. In earlier periods of monarchy, titles directly correlated with land ownership, military responsibility, and feudal control. A duke was not merely a nobleman. He was a regional authority who could marshal armies and levy taxes. Similarly, a prince wasn't just the child of a monarch, but often a ruler-in-waiting or an administrator of territory. While such direct powers no longer apply today in the United Kingdom, the symbolic weight of titles persists. They carry connotations of authority, continuity, and legitimacy that stretch beyond legal definitions. When a member of the royal family is titled, that designation can open doors in international diplomacy, shape the public narrative, and even influence political discourse, albeit indirectly. The use of titles in international diplomacy has often been subtle but strategic. For instance, when the monarch or a senior royal undertakes a state visit, their title often frames the tone of the engagement. Though they do not negotiate treaties or participate in parliamentary decision-making, royals often serve as unofficial ambassadors. The title Prince of Wales on a global stage suggests more than ceremonial presence. It carries with it the weight of history, culture, and presumed leadership. This dynamic has not been without controversy. Critics argue that royal titles used in international contexts can blur the lines between democratic governance and monarchical symbolism. When a titled royal engages with heads of state, speaks on global issues, or participates in diplomatic ceremonies, it can create the illusion of political authority where none officially exists. Yet that illusion matters. In soft diplomacy, perception is as valuable as policy. Within the United Kingdom, the symbolic use of titles continues to evoke complex reactions from the public. To many, they offer a reassuring connection to national heritage and continuity. To others, they are outdated markers of privilege that highlight inequality and elitism. This duality creates a peculiar tension. On one hand, the royal family is expected to remain politically neutral and above the fray. On the other hand, their titles often give them a platform to influence public thought and debate. King Charles III, previously the Prince of Wales, was known for expressing opinions on environmental issues, architecture, and alternative medicine. These interventions, though presented as personal passions, were often seen as leveraging the authority associated with his title. The concern here isn't that a royal holds personal views, but that those views might carry disproportionate weight because of the symbolic capital their title conveys. This concern was notably highlighted in the so-called Black Spider memos, a series of letters written by Charles to government ministers during his time as Prince of Wales. These letters, handwritten and often underlined for emphasis, hence the nickname, covered a variety of policy issues, from military equipment to herbal remedies. Though the content of many letters was not overtly scandalous, the principle behind them sparked controversy. Should someone who will eventually be head of state and who is expected to remain neutral use the symbolic power of their title to influence governmental decisions? The very fact that the government fought to keep the memos private for years suggests how sensitive the issue of royal influence truly is. Even without formal power, a title like Prince of Wales carries enough historical and cultural weight to suggest influence, and influence that can be used, denied, or strategically implied. Within the royal family itself, titles operate as both symbols of status and instruments of control. They establish the internal hierarchy and define the public roles of each member. Senior royals receive prestigious titles that come with clear responsibilities and expectations. For example, the heir to the throne is traditionally given the titles of Prince of Wales and Duke of Cornwall, while other high-ranking royals may be granted dukedoms or earldoms upon marriage or at the monarch's discretion. These designations are not merely ceremonial. They dictate everything from funding and housing to public engagement and press scrutiny. Controversies have arisen when titles are withheld, removed, or denied. The decision not to grant the title Prince to Archie, the son of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, was one such example. Though Buckingham Palace cited technical rules dating back to George V, which limit the titles of Prince and Princess to the children and grandchildren of the sovereign, the situation reignited discussions about race, privilege, and institutional rigidity within the monarchy. The question was not simply about nomenclature but about what titles mean in terms of belonging, recognition, and public validation within the royal structure. Titles also create clear distinctions between working and non-working royals, a distinction that gained widespread attention when Prince Harry and Meghan chose to step back from royal duties. Though they retained their Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles, they agreed not to use the style Her Royal Highness in a working capacity. This subtle yet powerful shift marked a boundary between their continued identity as royals and their new life as private citizens. It underscored how titles can be both a source of privilege and a burden, expecting loyalty, restraint, and service in return for prestige and platform. This internal system of titles reflects broader social hierarchies and influences how the public views the monarchy itself. As the United Kingdom has become more democratic, multicultural, and egalitarian, public attitudes toward hereditary titles have become increasingly divided. For some, the pomp and pageantry remain a vital part of national identity and tradition. Royal weddings, jubilees, and funerals still attract millions of viewers worldwide. For others, the use of royal titles feels disconnected from contemporary values, symbols of inequality in a society striving for inclusion and fairness. One growing critique is that the institution of titles perpetuates class distinctions that no longer align with the democratic ideals of modern Britain. The fact that royal titles are inherited rather than earned strikes many as anachronistic. In a world where social mobility, meritocracy, and equal opportunity are celebrated, titles that confer status purely by birth seem increasingly at odds with prevailing values. This tension is especially visible during periods of political or economic hardship, when the privileges associated with titles such as publicly funded security, vast land ownership, and media access become subjects of public debate. The symbolic economy of titles also intersects with cultural representation and national identity. The title Prince of Wales, as mentioned previously, continues to be a lightning rod for political and cultural debate. Its origins in conquest granted to Edward I's son after the subjugation of the Welsh princes mean that for some in Wales, the title still represents an imposed authority. Despite efforts to reframe it as a unifying symbol, its historical baggage lingers. As devolution increases and national identities within the UK become more distinct, titles with such charged histories come under renewed scrutiny. The evolution of titles also reflects broader shifts in gender roles and representation. In previous generations, titles were strictly passed down male lines, and the role of women within the monarchy was largely shaped by marriage. Recent changes to the laws of succession, which now prioritize birth order over gender, have begun to reshape these dynamics. Yet the persistence of titles like Queen Consort, instead of simply Queen, and the rarity of dukedoms granted in a woman's own right, demonstrate how gendered assumptions remain embedded in the structure of royal titles. Public conversations around the monarchy's relevance often mirror debates about the role of titles themselves. Are they meaningful tools of cultural cohesion or outdated symbols of privilege? Should they evolve to reflect contemporary values or remain untouched as links to the past? These questions are no longer theoretical, they shape political discourse, influence public funding decisions, and affect how the monarchy is taught, portrayed, and understood. Critically, the monarchy's ability to maintain its symbolic power is deeply tied to public perception. Titles like king, prince, and duchess matter only insofar as the public believes they matter. In a media-saturated age where image is everything, the line between perception and reality is often blurred. Royals are now public figures who live in the spotlight, and the power their titles carry is constantly reinterpreted through media narratives, public reactions, and global events. A well-received speech, a controversial interview, or a viral photo can enhance or undermine the significance of a title in real time. Thus, titles today operate in a delicate balance. They are rooted in centuries of tradition but must be flexible enough to adapt to the cultural expectations of a new generation. They are markers of heritage and identity but must be earned continuously through public service and personal conduct. They create an internal logic within the royal family but must also align with the democratic principles of the nation they serve. As Britain continues to wrestle with its post-imperial identity, the relevance and future of the monarchy and its intricate system of titles remain open questions. Will the institution continue to modernize, redefining titles as symbols of service and national unity? Or will growing Republican sentiment and calls for structural reform eventually erode their meaning and function altogether? These are not just questions for the royal family, they are questions for the society that sustains them. The power of royal titles today lies not in legal authority or economic control, but in their ability to reflect, shape, and sometimes challenge the values of the society in which they exist. They are part of a national story, one that is constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted, and renegotiated. Behind the crown, beyond the pageantry, and within the seemingly rigid structures of the monarchy, titles remain potent instruments of symbolism, identity, and power. And like all symbols, their future will be determined not by tradition alone, but by the collective imagination and will of the people they are meant to serve. Throughout the long and often tumultuous arc of English history, few elements have been as persistent, adaptable, and symbolically rich as royal titles. More than mere words attached to names, these titles have woven themselves into the cultural, linguistic, and political tapestry of the nation. From the earliest usage of king and queen, to the proliferation of titles like duke, earl, prince, and princess, they have both mirrored and shaped the identity of England, later Britain, through centuries of upheaval, conquest, consolidation, and modernization. Their influence stretches beyond courts and castles. It reaches into literature, language, diplomacy, art, media, tourism, and popular imagination. In the legacy of English royal titles, one finds a condensed reflection of the country's broader story, its struggles with power, its negotiation between tradition and reform, and its ever-shifting sense of self. The emergence and entrenchment of royal titles in English history have had a profound effect on how the English language developed and, in turn, how the English people came to conceive of authority, class, and hierarchy. The linguistic impact of these titles is not confined to their literal use. King, from the Old English signing, and queen, from quen, were some of the earliest formal indicators of structured leadership and rulership in Anglo-Saxon England. They helped codify ideas of centralized power and legitimacy. As England encountered Norman French culture and language following the 1066 Norman conquest, the language of governance and aristocracy began to shift. Titles like duke and count, although England eventually preferred earl, became linguistic symbols of rank and governance, and the presence of these words in English reflects both the feudal structure imposed by the Normans and the integration of French vocabulary into the English lexicon. Even today, the vocabulary of monarchy continues to carry social and political resonance. Words like royal, noble, majesty, and sovereign not only denote formal positions or qualities but also carry implied authority and grandeur. Literature and drama, especially in the early modern period, solidified these associations. Shakespeare's plays are perhaps the most prominent examples of how royal titles became metaphors for order, chaos, legitimacy, and betrayal. His portrayal of kingship in plays like Henry IV, Henry V, and Macbeth did not simply reflect contemporary ideas of royalty but actively helped shape public understanding of monarchy, leadership, and divine right. Royal titles in this context become not just social markers but vehicles for exploring national identity, political legitimacy, and moral authority. Culturally, royal titles have always been tied to notions of national unity and identity. The title Defender of the Faith, granted to Henry VIII by the Pope and later retained by English monarchs even after the Reformation, exemplifies how a title can become a point of political identity. In breaking from Rome and declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, Henry VIII transformed royal authority from a temporal position to a spiritual one, and this shift forever altered the landscape of English society. Titles in this sense became ideological tools, legitimizing the monarchy's centrality in the spiritual as well as political life of the nation. Such examples demonstrate how titles were not passive indicators of status but active instruments in the shaping of policy, theology, and national myth. Moreover, royal titles have often been used to project stability and continuity during periods of national uncertainty. The Tudor and Stuart periods, rife with civil strife, religious tension, and succession crises, saw titles used as both political bargaining chips and symbols of legitimacy. Claiming a title whether as a rival claimant to the throne or as a royal offspring was not a matter of vanity but of political survival. The Wars of the Roses were, in many ways, contests over who had the stronger claim to the title King of England. These conflicts underscore how much importance both elites and the broader populace placed on titles as authenticators of rule. Even as Britain transitioned into a constitutional monarchy, with diminishing direct powers for the sovereign, titles retained their symbolic significance. The Victorian era saw an expansion of royal titulature, with Queen Victoria becoming Empress of India in 1876, a move that tied the British monarchy to the growing imperial project. The symbolic power of royal titles was thus extended beyond Britain's borders, serving as tools of colonial influence and national propaganda. Victoria's new title was meant to reinforce the monarchy's global prestige, affirm the supposed legitimacy of British rule in India, and present a unified image of empire to both domestic and international audiences. In the modern era, the symbolic weight of royal titles remains strong, even as their political power continues to erode. One of the most visible manifestations of their enduring influence is in the global fascination with the British royal family. This fascination is not limited to Britain or to countries within the Commonwealth. It extends across the globe, attracting intense media attention, scholarly inquiry, and public interest. Titles play a significant role in this phenomenon. Prince William, Duchess Kate, King Charles, and Queen Camilla are names that carry built-in narratives. They evoke history, tradition, glamour, and drama. Much of the intrigue surrounding these individuals is tied not just to who they are, but to what their titles signify. The British monarchy's global brand is intrinsically linked to its use of titles. These titles are central to the carefully curated image that the monarchy projects, one that is steeped in ceremony, tradition, and continuity. The appeal of this brand is especially evident in the tourism industry. Every year, millions of visitors flock to the United Kingdom to see Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, and other royal sites. These locations are not simply historic buildings. They are living symbols of a titled monarchy that continues to play a role in the national narrative. Tourists are drawn not just by architecture but by the aura of royalty, the possibility of glimpsing a titled figure, and the allure of ceremonies like Trooping the Colour or royal weddings. Royal titles also generate substantial media revenue. Television networks, streaming services, and publishing houses routinely produce content centered around the monarchy. Whether it's dramatizations like The Crown, documentaries, or tabloid coverage of royal events, the titles attached to each figure serve as entry points for stories that mix the personal with the political. This commodification of titles illustrates their continuing relevance in the marketplace of ideas and entertainment. The public is not just consuming news about Charles or William or Meghan. They are engaging with stories about kings, princes, and duchesses, archetypes that evoke centuries of tradition, power, and intrigue. The enduring fascination with royal titles does not mean, however, that they are immune from critique or evolution. In recent years, debates have intensified over the relevance of these titles in a society that increasingly values equality, transparency, and meritocracy. The question of whether titles will evolve or remain unchanged is central to broader discussions about the future of the monarchy itself. In a democratic society where the concept of inherited privilege sits uneasily alongside ideals of fairness and opportunity, the persistence of hereditary titles can appear anachronistic. Some argue that the monarchy must modernize by reforming or eliminating the use of titles altogether. They contend that titles reinforce outdated class hierarchies and perpetuate a system of social division. Others argue for a more moderate approach, retaining titles but redefining their purpose and presentation. This might involve clearer distinctions between ceremonial and functional roles, reducing public funding for titled royals, or greater transparency about the benefits and responsibilities that accompany a title. The debate is not only about the monarchy's symbolic value but about its social contract with the public. The recent generations of royals have begun to respond to these pressures, albeit cautiously. King Charles III has long spoken about a slimmed-down monarchy, focusing public resources and ceremonial duties on a smaller group of core working royals. This approach implicitly recognizes that not all titles carry the same weight or relevance in the modern world. By reducing the number of actively titled figures involved in public engagements, the monarchy hopes to retain legitimacy while adapting to contemporary expectations. Yet titles remain powerful tools for signaling succession, duty, and belonging. The title Prince of Wales, for instance, continues to designate the heir apparent to the throne, and its reassignment following Charles's ascension to the throne underscores its enduring symbolic value. While some in Wales object to the title's historical connotations, others see it as a vital link between past and future. The tension between honoring tradition and acknowledging change is encapsulated in such debates, and the future of titles like this one may depend on the monarchy's ability to navigate competing narratives. What might the future of royal titles look like in a world that is rapidly changing? It is likely that titles will continue to evolve, reflecting shifts in public values, political structures, and cultural norms. One possible trajectory is a further separation between the ceremonial and personal identities of royals. Titles could become more honorary, detached from state funding or institutional authority. Alternatively, titles might be reshaped to emphasize service rather than status, like by highlighting the charitable or diplomatic work associated with a titled role. Another possibility is the increasing regionalization or contextualization of titles. As the United Kingdom grapples with the rise of national identities in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, titles may need to be reconsidered in light of local sensitivities and aspirations. The idea of a Prince of Scotland, or a reformulated Prince of Wales, could emerge as ways to retain tradition while acknowledging political realities. Digital culture may also influence how royal titles are perceived and used. Social media has changed the relationship between public figures and their audiences, creating new forms of visibility and accountability. Titles once insulated by protocol are now subject to online discourse, memes, critique, and adoration. The way royals engage with these platforms may shape the symbolic power of their titles in the decades to come. Perhaps the most important consideration is that titles, like all cultural symbols, derive their meaning from collective belief. As long as people care about them, whether in reverence, critique, or curiosity, royal titles will remain relevant. Their form and function may change, but their role as vessels of historical memory, cultural imagination, and social identity is unlikely to disappear. The legacy of English royal titles, then, is not confined to dusty chronicles or ceremonial robes. It is alive in the language we speak, the stories we tell, the identities we claim, and the institutions we debate. Titles are both anchors and sails. They tie us to our past even as they propel us into the future. Whether they remain as they are or transform in unexpected ways, their story is inextricably linked to the story of England itself, a nation forever negotiating the balance between tradition and change, heritage and innovation, monarchy and modernity. The legacy of English royal titles, having been shaped across centuries of historical upheaval, cultural transformation, and political evolution, remains one of the most enduring elements of the United Kingdom's identity. These titles, once the markers of absolute authority, now often ceremonial and symbolic, continue to exert a subtle but powerful influence over society, national memory, and the global perception of Britain. From the primal authority embodied in the simple term king, to the multifaceted symbolism carried by designations such as Prince of Wales, the use and persistence of royal titles tell a deeper story about power, legitimacy, tradition, and the human desire to both categorize and venerate leadership. As the monarchy stands today at a cultural and constitutional crossroads, it is essential to reflect on not just what these titles have meant, but what they still mean and what they could come to mean in the future. At their inception, titles such as King and Queen were not mere decorations. They were assertions of control over land, people, and destiny. They denoted divine right, martial victory, or hereditary privilege. The meaning of these titles evolved in response to changing historical conditions, often shaped by conquest, religion, civil war, and diplomacy. The Norman conquest of 1066 marked a pivotal transformation, introducing a feudal hierarchy of titles that reshaped English nobility and governance. The imported titles of Duke, Count, eventually adapted as Earl, and baron created a structured social order where power could be distributed and reinforced through loyal vassals. These titles were more than ranks. They were instruments of control, incentives for loyalty, and mechanisms for the consolidation of the monarch's rule over a fragmented and often rebellious land. Over time, the royal family developed an even more nuanced system of titles to reflect shifting political needs and societal expectations. Prince and princess became identifiers of royal lineage, linking the bearer to both privilege and responsibility. The title Prince of Wales, in particular, evolved from a post-conquest assertion of dominance over Wales into a deeply symbolic and often controversial marker of succession. Despite its origins in colonial imposition, it became an established part of the royal fabric, albeit one increasingly questioned in an age of heightened awareness of national and regional identity. The enduring attachment to royal titles speaks to their adaptability. Titles that were once tightly linked to military power and land ownership have transitioned into more ceremonial, performative roles, though not without contention. This transition did not occur suddenly. The shift from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy was gradual, influenced by events such as the Magna Carta, the English Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, and the development of parliamentary democracy. With each change, the monarchy's real political power diminished, but its symbolic significance remained. As political structures democratized, royal titles transformed from active instruments of governance into emblems of continuity and tradition. That symbolic power still holds tremendous cultural weight. Royal titles are embedded in the national consciousness and remain an integral part of Britain's global identity. They evoke images of history and ceremony, reinforce notions of continuity and legitimacy, and inspire fascination both at home and abroad. In many ways, the titles carried by modern royals are a kind of living heritage, a link between a modern, media-saturated society and a storied, ritualistic past. Tourists visiting London for a glimpse of Buckingham Palace or lining the streets for a royal wedding are not simply admiring architecture or clothing. They are participating in a cultural ritual century in the making, in which titles are key markers of meaning. Yet in modern Britain, a country deeply committed to democratic values and transparency, these titles also face increasing scrutiny. For many, the continued use of royal titles, especially those that carry historical baggage or are associated with vast personal wealth and privilege, raises uncomfortable questions about class inequality, institutional accountability, and the role of inherited power in a meritocratic society. The fact that certain titles come with immense landholdings and wealth, such as the Duchy of Cornwall, which generates income for the Prince of Wales, can seem incongruent with public expectations for equity and fairness. Public debate continues to intensify around whether the monarchy and, by extension, the titles it bestows should be reformed, downsized, or even abolished. In this context, royal titles have become political symbols as much as ceremonial ones. To critics, they represent outdated hierarchies that no longer serve a purpose in a modern nation. To supporters, they are treasured parts of a unique national tradition, a stabilizing force in times of change, and a soft power asset that few nations can match. The monarchy's response to these critiques has been cautious but not unresponsive. King Charles III has shown signs of moving toward a more streamlined royal family, focusing attention and resources on a smaller circle of working royals. This is not merely a financial decision. It is a tacit acknowledgement of the need for the monarchy to maintain relevance and adapt to changing public attitudes. Such moves, while modest, reflect the institution's broader strategy of preserving tradition while demonstrating flexibility. The question remains, will royal titles continue to hold significance in the decades ahead? The answer depends on how well the monarchy manages its public image and navigates the cultural expectations of a new generation. In an era defined by social media, global connectivity, and growing demands for social justice, traditional forms of authority must constantly reaffirm their value. Titles must be more than relics. They must be recontextualized and reimagined in ways that resonate with the values of the society they serve. There is potential for titles to evolve in function and perception. Perhaps future royal titles will be more closely associated with social or environmental work, emphasizing service and responsibility rather than status alone. They might also be reshaped to reflect a more inclusive view of British identity, acknowledging the multicultural reality of contemporary Britain. Titles like Duke or Princess might carry associations not only of grandeur but also of specific charitable missions, public outreach, or civic engagement. Such evolutions could reinforce the monarchy's relevance in a rapidly changing world. On the other hand, if the monarchy resists change or appear disconnected from public sentiment, titles could become increasingly symbolic and eventually obsolete. The decline of monarchies elsewhere in Europe offers a glimpse into one possible future: a transformation from sovereign institutions into cultural artifacts. In such a scenario, royal titles might remain in name only, maintained for tradition's sake but devoid of political or social function. Whatever direction the monarchy takes, it is clear that royal titles will remain powerful symbols. They embody the contradictions and complexities of British identity, simultaneously traditional and adaptive, elitist and public-facing, historical and contemporary. Their evolution reflects broader national conversations about heritage, equality, power, and belonging. English royal titles are not just labels; they are narratives in themselves, filled with layers of meaning that shift over time. They have shaped the English language, influenced culture, reflected and reinforced political authority, and captivated the world's imagination. As we move further into the 21st century, the continued relevance of these titles will depend on the monarchy's ability to balance the weight of tradition with the demands of progress. Whether redefined or retained in their current form, royal titles will continue to offer a unique lens through which to understand England's past, its present identity, and its aspirations for the future.